The night of the charity gala was bright and full of excitement. Expensive cars rolled up in front of the grand hall, their headlights shining against the marble steps. Inside, laughter and music filled the air. The city's most well-known artists, business figures, and socialites had gathered together for an evening of elegance, fine food, and live performances. Everyone was dressed in shimmering gowns and tailored suits, holding glasses of sparkling drinks as they chatted about art, music, and life. Among all those glamorous people, no one noticed the quiet woman standing near the entrance. She wore a simple black dress and held an old violin case close to her chest. Her hair was tied back neatly and she seemed calm but distant, as if she didn't quite belong there. She had been invited at the last minute after one of the evening's performers suddenly fell ill. The organizers needed a replacement and someone had mentioned her name, though no one really knew who she was. When she arrived, one of the assistants looked at her with confusion. "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" he asked politely, scanning his list. She nodded softly and handed over her invitation letter. It was genuine. He gave a short smile and led her inside, though his eyes carried a trace of doubt. The guests around her barely glanced her way. They were too busy taking photos, greeting old friends, and discussing the auction items for the night. The woman stood quietly near a corner, watching the others with a small, polite smile. Her violin case looked old. The handle was worn and the edges were scratched. It didn't match the polished, expensive instruments that most professionals brought to such events. A few musicians were gathered near the stage, tuning their instruments. One of them, a young man in a crisp suit, noticed her case and raised an eyebrow. "You're performing tonight?" he asked curiously. She nodded again. He chuckled, half joking. "That violin looks older than me." She only smiled. He didn't mean to be cruel, but his tone carried a quiet arrogance, the kind that often comes from those too used to applause. Others nearby overheard and laughed softly. She didn't react. Instead, she took a deep breath and turned her gaze toward the stage. The hall was decorated beautifully. Golden lights, red curtains, and a grand chandelier that glimmered above the audience. The evening had already begun with several performances. A young pianist had played a fast, dramatic piece that earned loud applause. Then a soprano singer filled the room with her powerful voice, leaving the guests cheering. Everything was going perfectly, and the crowd was in high spirits. When it came close to her turn, the host checked the schedule and frowned slightly. "Who is this performer again?" he asked one of the assistants. She wasn't on the original list. The assistant explained quickly. "She's the replacement for the violinist who canceled." The host hesitated. "Is she any good?" The assistant shrugged. "I don't really know." The host looked uncertain but decided to keep the program moving. The audience didn't know what was coming, and neither did he. The woman stood backstage quietly watching as the performer before her finished their act and received warm applause. She could feel her heart beating faster with every clap. She gripped her violin case a little tighter. When the music ended, the host walked onto the stage and smiled toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in his usual cheerful tone, "our next performance is a bit of a surprise. Please welcome our guest violinist." There was polite clapping, the kind that happens when people don't know what to expect. The woman walked onto the stage slowly, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor. The bright lights hit her face and she had to squint for a second before adjusting. She could feel hundreds of eyes watching her, curious, judgmental, and unsure. Some in the front row whispered to each other. "Who is she?" one woman murmured. "I don't recognize her." Another man leaned toward his companion. "Maybe a student performer?" The quiet buzz of uncertain chatter filled the hall. The woman placed her violin case gently on a small table beside her. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a violin with faded varnish and tiny marks along its body, signs of age and use. She lifted it carefully like it was something sacred. A small boy sitting near the stage leaned toward his mother. "Mom, why is her violin so old?" he whispered. The mother smiled softly. "Maybe it plays beautiful music," she replied. The woman took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. For a second, she closed her eyes. In that silence, memories came flooding back. Nights spent practicing in a small room, tears shed over broken strings, years of lost chances. She had once been on bigger stages under brighter lights, but after life had dealt her unexpected pain, She had stopped performing completely. Music had been both her gift and her grief. Tonight, for the first time in years, she was holding her violin not for fame, but for something far more personal, to remember who she was. The host, standing nearby, looked at her with gentle impatience. "Whenever you're ready," he said quietly. She nodded and stepped toward the microphone. The audience waited. She lifted the violin under her chin and raised the bow. The first sound of the string being touched echoed lightly through the room, a faint whisper of what was to come. But before she began, she paused again, steadying her breath. In that small moment, a strange quiet settled over the audience. The laughter, the whispers, even the clinking of glasses, everything faded. People leaned forward slightly, expecting perhaps an average performance from an unknown guest. No one imagined what was about to happen. She began to play a slow, gentle note. It floated through the air like a whisper carried by wind. The sound was fragile yet full of emotion. Her fingers moved with delicate precision, and her bow glided smoothly as if she were painting the air with sound. Within seconds, the mood of the room changed completely. The chatter stopped. The crowd that had once seemed uninterested now sat completely still. There was something about her tone, pure, haunting, filled with life and sorrow at once. Every person in the hall could feel it. It was not just skill. It was soul, but she didn't see them. She didn't see the crowd, the lights, or the stage. In her mind, she was somewhere else. In a quiet room years ago, playing for someone who used to listen closely, smiling every time she finished. She felt tears form behind her closed eyes but didn't stop. Her bow moved faster, her notes grew deeper, and the music wrapped around the hall like a story that only the heart could understand. From the back of the hall, the event director, the same one who doubted her earlier, leaned forward, completely silent. He looked around and saw faces changed. People were not just listening. They were feeling. Some had closed their eyes. Others had their mouths slightly open in awe. When the first movement ended, there was no applause yet. No one dared break the spell. She paused for a breath, lowered her bow for a second, and then lifted it again. The second piece she played was faster, more powerful, a storm of sound that filled every corner of the hall. Her hands moved like they were born for this, and the violin sang in a way that no one had expected. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped, and then, as quickly as it began, the music faded into silence. The last note hung in the air, trembling, beautiful and unforgettable. The audience didn't move. There was a moment of stillness, and then, slowly, someone began to clap. Another followed. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted into applause. People stood up from their seats, clapping and cheering, some even shouting, "Bravo!" The host, who had been speechless the entire time, looked at her with wide eyes. The woman bowed gently, her face calm, though her eyes glistened with emotion. She looked almost shy about the attention, as if she had not expected any of it. Backstage, someone whispered, "Who is she?" Another voice replied softly, "Whoever she is, she just played like a legend." The night that began with doubts and whispers had suddenly transformed. No one cared anymore about her old violin or simple dress. What they had witnessed was far beyond appearances. It was something real, the kind of performance that touches the heart because it comes from one. As she walked off the stage, she held her violin close once again, her steps slow and quiet. Behind her, the applause continued to echo, long after she disappeared behind the curtain. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her music had spoken for her, louder and more beautifully than words ever could. The applause was still echoing behind her as she walked down the narrow hallway leading backstage. The sound followed her like a wave that refused to fade away. For a moment, she stopped and looked at her violin. The old wood shone faintly under the backstage light, the scratches and faded color telling stories of years gone by. She ran her fingers over the surface gently, the way someone touches an old photograph. A stagehand approached her with wide eyes. "That was unbelievable," he whispered, still in awe. She smiled politely and nodded, but didn't say anything. Inside, her heart was still racing. It had been years since she played in front of an audience, and she had forgotten what that kind of silence felt like. The silence that holds its breath before the first note and doesn't exhale until the last one fades. She found a quiet corner near the exit where the noise of the hall was just a distant hum. She sat down on a wooden bench, her hands still trembling from the performance. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. The warmth of the lights, the softness of the sound, the faces in the crowd, and everything replayed in her mind. She felt both light and heavy at once. Meanwhile, in the main hall, people were still talking about her. The host had gone off stage and was surrounded by guests asking questions. "Who was that woman?" someone asked eagerly. "I've never seen her before." "She was extraordinary." The host scratched his head, embarrassed. "Honestly, I don't know. She was a last-minute replacement. We didn't even have her full background." Another guest, a music teacher from a local academy, shook his head in disbelief. "That wasn't the playing of an amateur," he said quietly. "That was the touch of someone who's lived through music. You can't fake that kind of emotion." Others nodded. They couldn't explain what they had just witnessed, but they all agreed that it was something special. It wasn't just the technique. It was the feeling behind every sound. People started whispering her story to one another, each adding their own version, as rumors often grow in places where mystery lives. Some said she must have been a world-famous violinist performing under a false name. Others thought she was a retired prodigy who had come back after a long time away. No one really knew, but everyone felt one thing, that something remarkable had just happened. Backstage, the event director finally found her. He had been the one who doubted her earlier, the one who had asked, "Are you sure you're ready?" Now his tone was completely different. "That was breathtaking," he said sincerely, walking closer. "You had everyone stunned. Where did you learn to play like that?" She looked up at him with gentle eyes and smiled faintly. "I used to play a long time ago," she replied softly. "I just stopped for a while." He nodded slowly, unsure what to say next. "Well, I hope you never stop again. That was something I'll never forget." Then he left her to rest, sensing she wasn't the type who enjoyed too much attention. She sat there alone for a while longer, the soft sounds of the crowd slowly fading as the next performer took the stage. Her heart still carried the echoes of her music. Playing again had felt both strange and familiar, like returning to a home that had changed with time. A small group of young musicians passed by, whispering excitedly. One of them noticed her and stopped. "Excuse me," he said shyly. "I just wanted to say your playing was beyond words. I've never heard anything like it." She smiled kindly. "Thank you," she said. "Keep practicing. The music will always be there for you when words aren't enough." The boy nodded with admiration, as if he had just met his hero. Then he hurried off to rejoin his group. The night continued with other performances, but no one could forget the woman with the old violin. Even as talented singers and pianists took their turns, the energy in the room had changed. People had been reminded of something raw and real. That music isn't about perfection. It's about connection. Later, during the dinner that followed, she sat quietly at one of the back tables away from the spotlight. She wasn't looking for recognition. She didn't want interviews or questions. She was just grateful to have played again, to have felt that deep, trembling joy that only comes from doing something you were born to do. A man sitting nearby leaned toward her with a friendly smile. "You were the violinist, right?" he asked. She nodded. "That was remarkable. You moved the entire room." "Thank you," she said softly. "Do you perform often?" he asked curiously. "Not anymore," she replied after a short pause. "I used to. But life has a way of changing our paths." The man nodded, sensing there was more behind those words but choosing not to press. "Well," he said with a warm smile, "whatever brought you back tonight, I'm glad it did." She looked down at her hands resting on the table. The faint marks on her fingers were still there, the kind only musicians carry. She ran her thumb over them, feeling a quiet pride. Across the room, several guests still talked about her performance. Some wanted to know her name. Others simply wanted to thank her for the way she made them feel. One older woman was seen wiping tears from her eyes as she told her friend, "That song reminded me of my husband. He used to love the violin." Moments like that were why she had always loved music, not because of applause or fame, but because sound had the power to touch the heart without saying a word. After the event ended, people began leaving in groups, their voices echoing through the wide hallway. The woman stayed behind, waiting until the crowd thinned. The grand hall, now quieter, felt almost peaceful. She walked back to the stage once more, alone. The lights were dim now and the chairs were empty. She stood there for a while, staring at the spot where she had stood earlier. It was strange how quickly a stage could go from being full of energy to complete silence. She placed her violin case on a chair and slowly began to pack her instrument. As she did, she noticed a small piece of paper tucked under one of the strings. It wasn't there before. Curious, she unfolded it. It was a simple note written in neat handwriting. "Your music touched something in me I thought was lost. Thank you." She smiled softly, holding the note close for a moment before slipping it into her bag. She didn't know who had written it, but somehow it felt like enough. As she left the hall, the night air met her with a cool breeze. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and the sound of traffic blended softly with the faint ringing in her ears from the music. She walked slowly, her steps light, her mind calm. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. At the bus stop, a young couple was talking quietly. The woman noticed the violin case and smiled. "Were you at that gala?" she asked kindly. "Yes," she replied with a small nod. The man grinned. "We heard about the violinist everyone's talking about. Was that you?" She laughed softly, almost shyly. "Maybe." They smiled back, clearly moved even by her modesty. "Well," the young woman said, "whoever you are, people will remember that performance for a long time." The bus arrived and she stepped inside, finding a seat near the window. As the city moved past outside, she leaned her head against the glass and watched the lights blur into streaks of gold and white. Her reflection looked tired but peaceful. She thought about how strange life could be, how the things you once let go of sometimes find their way back when you least expect them to. She had gone to the gala expecting nothing, no recognition, no applause, no praise. Yet she had left with something far more valuable, a reminder that her music still had meaning. As the bus rolled through the quiet streets, she rested her hand on the violin case beside her. It felt warm, alive, almost breathing. She smiled faintly to herself. Maybe this was not the end of something, but the beginning again. And though no one on that bus knew who she was or what she had done that night, the softest glow lingered around her. A quiet peace that only comes after doing something true. The city continued to hum outside, unaware that it carried within it a woman who had just reminded an entire room what real beauty sounds like. The next morning came quietly. The soft sunlight spilled through the thin curtains of her small apartment. Dust floated in the light like tiny golden sparks. The violin case lay open on the table beside her, still carrying the faint scent of the stage lights from the night before. She had barely slept. Her mind had been replaying every moment of the performance, the lights, the silence, the faces frozen in surprise. It didn't feel real. After so many years of hiding her music, to finally hear it echo again in a hall full of people felt like something she had dreamed, not lived. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. They were still sore from the performance, but she didn't mind. Those were good aches, the kind that came from doing something meaningful. On the small table lay a newspaper folded in half. She hadn't bought it herself. Her elderly neighbor had slipped it under her door early that morning. The headline wasn't about her, but when she turned to the art section, a small column caught her eye. "Unknown violinist captures hearts at charity gala." There was no photo, no name, just a few lines describing how a mysterious woman had delivered one of the most emotional performances of the evening. The article said her playing felt like poetry written in sound, and that the audience was left breathless. She read those words several times, not out of pride, but disbelief. For years she had convinced herself that her music didn't matter anymore, yet somehow people had listened, really listened, and felt something again. She closed the newspaper gently and stood up. On the shelf by the window, a small framed photo sat gathering dust. She picked it up, brushing it clean with her sleeve. In the picture, a younger version of herself stood with a man holding the same old violin. They were smiling at each other, her chest tightened. It had been many years since he was gone. He had been her teacher, her closest friend, and the reason she had started playing in the first place. Losing him had broken her in ways she never talked about. After his passing, she couldn't even look at the violin without feeling a wave of grief that took her breath away. But last night had changed something. When she stood on that stage again, it felt as if he was there, not in body, but in spirit, somewhere behind her, guiding her hands, helping her remember who she was. She placed the photo back on the shelf and looked out the window. The city was awake now. The sound of cars, children, and distant voices filled the air. She wondered how many people from last night were still thinking about her music. She wondered if it had reached anyone who needed to hear it, the way it had once reached her. That afternoon, she decided to go out for a walk. She carried her violin with her, not because she planned to play, but because she didn't like leaving it behind anymore. It felt right beside her, like a part of her heart that had finally come back home. The streets were alive with noise and color, vendors calling out, musicians busking on corners, the smell of roasted nuts and coffee drifting through the air. She stopped when she saw a group of children watching a young street performer play guitar. They clapped and cheered when he finished, tossing coins into his open case. Something about their laughter made her smile. Without thinking too much, she found an empty bench nearby, sat down and opened her own violin case. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing the strings. It had been years since she played outside like this. People walked past, paying her little attention. But then quietly she began to play. The first notes were soft, uncertain, like a whisper testing the air. A few passers-by slowed their steps. Her tone carried warmth that wrapped around the street like sunlight breaking through clouds. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was gentle, full of emotion. Within minutes, a small crowd gathered. Some stood still, others sat nearby to listen. The sound of the city seemed to fade beneath the sweetness of her melody. Even the children stopped talking and watched quietly, their eyes wide. She wasn't performing for applause this time. She played because she wanted to share something beautiful, something honest. Every note told a part of her story, the loss, the silence, the rediscovery of her own voice. When she finished, the crowd clapped softly. A few people smiled. One woman wiped away a tear, and a little girl came forward to drop a flower into her violin case. The woman looked up and smiled gratefully. An older man who had been listening from a few steps away walked closer. "You play like someone who's seen the world," he said kindly. She chuckled softly. "Maybe just someone who's lived through music." He nodded with understanding. "Don't stop," he said simply before walking away. She watched him disappear into the crowd and then looked down at the flower in her case. It was a small white bloom, fragile and bright. She carefully picked it up and tucked it into her violin bow. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was running from her past. Instead, she was walking towards something new but somehow familiar. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the city lights began to glow, she returned home. The day had left her tired, but in a good way. She placed her violin back on the table and made herself a simple cup of tea. She sat by the window again, watching the sky turn orange and pink. Her thoughts wandered back to the night of the gala, the faces of the audience, the way silence had filled the hall before her first note, the warmth of the applause that followed. She realized something then. All those years she thought she had lost her gift, it hadn't truly gone anywhere. It had just been waiting for her to find the courage to use it again. As the night deepened, she took out a small notebook from a drawer. Inside were pages filled with half-finished melodies and scattered words. She began writing again, humming softly as her pen moved. Notes became phrases, phrases became lines of music. She stayed up late that night, lost in the rhythm of creation. It felt like breathing after holding her breath for too long. The violin rested beside her, and every so often she would pick it up and play a few bars to test the sound. Somewhere in the middle of the night, she stopped writing and smiled to herself. Her life had been quiet for so long, maybe too quiet. But now it was beginning to sing again. The next day, she received an unexpected message from the event director. He had tracked down her number through the charity organizers. The message read, "People are still talking about your performance. There have been requests for you to perform again next month at another event. Would you consider it?" She read it twice, her heart beating faster. For years she had avoided invitations, turned down offers, and stayed hidden. But now she found herself smiling instead of hesitating. Maybe it was time. She replied simply, "Yes." After sending the message, she placed the violin on her lap and ran her fingers across the strings once more. It hummed softly in response, as if it too was ready for what came next. The following weeks passed in quiet preparation. She practiced every day, not out of pressure, but out of love. The music flowed easier now. It wasn't about proving herself. It was about sharing what she felt. Sometimes when she played, she imagined her old teacher listening somewhere beyond the light, smiling, proud, whispering, "You never truly stopped." The night before her next performance, she stood by the window once more, watching the stars. The city was quiet again, and so was her heart. She whispered softly to the air, "Tomorrow, I'll play for you." And though no one else heard those words, the night seemed to hold them gently. She closed the window, set down her cup, and placed her violin back in its case. Her fingers brushed the small white flower still tucked inside. It had dried, but she kept it anyway, a reminder that beauty often grows in unexpected places. As she turned off the lights and lay down to rest, a peaceful smile formed on her face. For the first time in a very long time, the silence around her didn't feel empty. It felt full of hope, full of promise, full of the music waiting to be played. And when she finally drifted off to sleep, the faint sound of her own melody seemed to play softly in her dreams, gentle, pure, and endless. The day of her second performance arrived quietly, yet the feeling inside her was anything but quiet. She woke before sunrise, unable to sleep any longer. The light outside was soft and gray, painting the sky like a canvas waiting for color. The city was still asleep, but her mind was already on the stage. The faces, the lights, the sound of her bow touching the strings. She boiled water for tea, her hands steady, but her heart unsteady. On the small table near the window sat her violin case, open slightly, the edge of the instrument glowing faintly in the morning light. She stared at it for a while, lost in thought. This time she wasn't just a last-minute replacement. People were coming specifically to hear her. That thought frightened her a little. For years she had hidden from attention. When she first stopped performing, it wasn't because she had lost her skill. It was because she had lost her reason to play. Music had always been something she shared with someone who believed in her more than anyone else. When that person was gone, the music lost its meaning. Every note had felt like an echo of something she could never bring back. But life has strange ways of returning what you think you've lost. That night at the gala had changed everything. It had reopened a part of her heart that had been locked for years. By late afternoon, she arrived at the concert hall where the event was being held. It wasn't as large as the first one, but it had a warmth to it. A smaller stage, soft yellow lights, and seats arranged close enough for everyone to feel the music up close. When she entered, the organizers greeted her with genuine smiles. Some had been there at the charity gala, and still remembered the way the audience had gone silent that night. "We're so glad you agreed to perform," one of them said. "People have been talking about your last performance for weeks." She thanked them politely. Inside, she felt a quiet mix of nerves and gratitude. She wasn't used to people knowing her name, and she wasn't sure she ever wanted fame. She only wanted to play, honestly, humbly, and with feeling. Backstage, she tuned her violin slowly. The familiar vibrations filled the room, calming her racing thoughts. Her hands moved with care, each adjustment bringing the instrument to life. It was like greeting an old friend. As she prepared, the event director walked in with a small smile. "There's something you should know," he said kindly. "Tonight, a few guests from the music press are here. They asked specifically to hear you." She looked up surprised. "The press?" He nodded. "Yes, word spreads quickly. But don't worry. Just do what you did last time. Play from your heart." She gave a small smile in return. "That's the only way I know how." When the time came, the host walked out on stage to introduce her. The lights dimmed, and the gentle hum of conversation faded into quiet anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host began, "tonight we are honored to welcome back a violinist whose music touched many hearts not long ago. Her playing reminds us that art is not just sound. It's emotion, it's memory, it's life itself." The applause that followed was soft but sincere. She stepped onto the stage, the spotlight finding her again. This time she wasn't nervous. There was still a flutter in her chest. Yes, but it was different. Not fear, but energy, like the pulse before a storm. She took her place at the center of the stage, lifted her violin, and let the silence wrap around her. Then, without hesitation, she began to play. The first piece was slow and tender. The notes rose and fell like gentle waves. Each sound carried a piece of her story, the years of quiet, the pain of loss, and the small, brave decision to return. The audience listened intently, their faces soft in the warm light. By the time she finished the first movement, the room was silent again. No coughs, no whispers, no shifting in chairs. Just stillness. She looked out over the audience, feeling something stir within her. For a moment she thought about ending there, but something inside urged her to speak. She lowered her violin slightly and stepped closer to the microphone. Her voice trembled at first, unused to being heard. "Before I play the next piece," she began softly, "I'd like to tell you a story." The audience leaned in, curious. "There was once a violinist," she said, choosing her words carefully. "She used to play everywhere, in small halls, big theaters, even on street corners. Music was her world. But one day the person who believed in her the most, the one who taught her how to listen, how to feel, how to live through her music, was gone. And when that happened, so was her will to play. She put away her violin and didn't touch it for years. The hall remained still. A few people exchanged quiet glances, realizing she was speaking about herself. She continued, her voice steadying. She thought silence would protect her. But silence is heavy. It follows you. It fills the spaces where sound should be. And one day she realized that the person she lost wouldn't have wanted that. He would have wanted her to keep playing, not for the world, but for herself. She paused, taking a slow breath. The audience was with her, every face reflecting empathy. "So she played again," she said softly, her eyes glimmering under the lights. At first, just one song, then another. And suddenly the music started to feel alive again, not as it once was, but as something new. Something born from both pain and peace. There was a moment of silence that followed, the kind that feels sacred. She lifted her violin once more and said quietly, "This next piece is for him." The bow touched the strings, and the first note broke through the silence like sunlight breaking through clouds. The melody she played was unlike anything she had done before. It was deep, mournful, but filled with love. Every note rose and fell like a memory being relived. People in the audience could feel it, the emotion behind every sound. Some closed their eyes, others wiped tears from their cheeks. It wasn't just music anymore. It was a story being told without words. As she played, her mind drifted back to her teacher's small music room, the one with old posters on the wall and the smell of pine rosin in the air. She could almost hear his voice again, calm and patient, reminding her, "Don't play the notes, play the meaning between them." And she did. When the last note faded, there was no immediate applause, just silence, a beautiful aching silence. Then slowly the sound of clapping began, soft at first, then louder until the entire hall stood on its feet. She lowered her bow, tears glistening in her eyes. She bowed deeply, her heart pounding not with pride but with release. The years of silence, the weight of grief, they all seemed to lift in that moment. As she turned to leave the stage, someone in the front row called out, "Thank you." It wasn't shouted, it was spoken gently with sincerity. That one word was enough to make her smile. Backstage, she sat on a small chair, breathing slowly. Her hands trembled again, but this time it wasn't from nerves. It was from the weight of everything she had finally let go. A young woman from the audience approached her with tears in her eyes. "Your story, your music," she said softly. "It reminded me of my father. He used to play guitar, but he stopped after my mother passed away. I think tonight I'll ask him to play again." The violinist smiled, touched beyond words. "Tell him the music never really leaves," she whispered. "It waits for us." The woman nodded, still wiping her eyes, and walked away. When the hall emptied, she remained behind for a few minutes. The lights were dim now, but the air still carried the warmth of what had just happened. She walked back onto the empty stage, stood where she had been, and looked out at the rows of seats. It was strange, and in her younger years she had played for crowds of hundreds. Yet tonight's smaller audience had meant more than any of those grand performances ever had. Because tonight she hadn't been pretending to be perfect. She had just been herself, flawed, real, and honest. She placed her violin carefully back in its case, touched the old wood one last time, and whispered softly, "Thank you." As she left the building and stepped into the cool night air, the stars shimmered faintly above the city. She felt light, lighter than she had in years. The streets were quiet, but inside her the music still played. And this time it didn't sound like sadness. It sounded like peace. Weeks passed since her last performance, yet the memory of that night stayed alive in her heart like a quiet melody that refused to fade. Each morning as she walked through the city streets, she could still hear the applause in her mind, not because she wanted recognition, but because it reminded her that her music had reached people again. Something had changed inside her since that evening. For the first time in years, she felt at peace with who she was. The fear that had once followed her like a shadow was gone. She no longer played to prove anything or to hide behind her music. She played because it made her feel alive. She had gone back to teaching a few private students, not many, just enough to stay close to music every day. Most were children, shy and curious, each holding a violin that seemed almost too big for their small hands. She taught them not only how to read notes, but how to listen, to themselves, to silence, to life. One afternoon, after a lesson, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was brief but clear. "We are organizing a concert to celebrate local artists who inspire others. We would be honored if you would perform as our final act." She read the message twice, unsure if it was real. For a moment she hesitated. Part of her wanted to decline politely. The last two performances had been beautiful but emotional. They had taken a lot out of her. Yet another part of her, the same quiet, brave part that had led her back to the stage once before, whispered, "Say yes." And she did. The concert was scheduled for a month later. It was to be held in the city's main cultural hall, a place she had only ever admired from the outside. The posters around town described it as a night of soulful stories through music. Her name appeared at the very bottom of the list, followed by the simple words, "Special finale performance." In the weeks that followed, she practiced more than she had in years, not out of pressure but out of love. Her small apartment was filled once again with the warm sound of her violin. Neighbors would sometimes pause in the hallway just to listen. A few even left small notes of encouragement at her door. Simple words like "beautiful" and "thank you for the music." One evening, as she played near the window, a little boy from the building across the street watched from his balcony. He waved shyly. She smiled and waved back, then played a short, cheerful tune just for him. He laughed, clapping his hands. Moments like that reminded her why she had started this journey in the first place. Music wasn't about perfection. It was about connection. When the day of the final concert finally came, she woke early, feeling a calm she hadn't known before. She didn't rush or worry. She took her time dressing, carefully packing her violin and walking to the hall through the quiet morning streets. The city felt alive in a gentle way, people smiling, sunlight reflecting on shop windows, and a soft breeze carrying the smell of roasted coffee. At the venue, the backstage area buzzed with nervous energy. Performers warmed up their instruments, dancers stretched, singers hummed softly. She greeted them all kindly, and many recognized her. Some approached her with admiration, saying, "We've heard about your last performance." It moved everyone. She thanked them with a modest smile. Compliments still made her shy. The evening began beautifully. One after another, local artists performed. Young singers, talented pianists, poets, and small ensembles. Each act brought its own kind of emotion. She watched them quietly from backstage, her violin resting on her lap. As her turn approached, the event organizer came up to her and said, "You'll close the night. Just play whatever your heart tells you. No one's expecting anything fancy. They're expecting you." She nodded slowly, her heart full. When it was finally her time, she stepped out onto the stage once again. The audience was larger than before, the seats full, the air thick with anticipation. Some faces in the front rows seemed familiar, people who had attended her earlier performances. The lights dimmed, and the host's voice echoed gently through the hall. "Our final performer tonight needs no grand introduction. Her music speaks for itself, honest, emotional, and deeply human. Please welcome her once more." Applause rose softly like waves rolling in from the distance. She walked to the center of the stage, her steps steady, her violin in hand. She took a deep breath, looked at the crowd, and smiled faintly. "Good evening," she said into the microphone. "I used to think that music was about being perfect. I spent years chasing flawless notes. But life has its own rhythm. Sometimes it's not perfect, but it's real. And that's what I want to play for you tonight." She lowered the microphone, closed her eyes, and began to play. The melody that flowed out was new, something she had written herself over the past few weeks. It began softly like a whisper, Each note rose with emotion, carrying stories of struggle, silence, rediscovery, and hope. The music built slowly, layer by layer, like a conversation between her heart and the strings.